Welcome to Sporacity, guys. I'm your host, Zayden Phillips. This is our first episode, so I thought I'd let you know I'm doing this for my senior project. We might continue this afterwards as well for fun, but we'll see where it goes. So I'm Zayden Phillips. I'm here with my co-hosts, Wesley the Family Tuber, Calvin Pineda, and Talon Hinsey.
We should probably voice so they know who we are.
I'm
Family Tuber.
I'm Calvin.
And I'm Talon. And our whole gimmick, I'm going to introduce this here a little bit, is that we have a list of topics that we can talk about, and this will go up in the beginning of all of our podcasts, but there will be a list of topics that we talk about, and we just go to a random number generator and label each of the items in the list, and whatever number we get from the generator, we match with an item on the list, and that's what we talk about.
Yeah.
Right. So we've done the random number generator, and today's topic is Disney.
So Disney as a whole, we're not particularly discussing any like Disney film, Disney Plus, any new Disney film in particular. We're just kind of talking about Disney as a company.
Although Wesley is the only one of us who's seen the new Star Wars film.
Indeed, so this will be interesting. And some of us also haven't seen Frozen 2.
Yes.
So.
All right, where do we start?
I can start because I'm very opinionated about Disney. I grew up loving to watch Disney films. I thought every animated film was a Disney film. I was like, whoa, Disney's super awesome and all that, right? But the older I get and the more that I see Disney do things, the less I actually like them and like their work and like actually supporting them. So that includes things like Disney Plus, and a lot of the new movies that are coming out are movies that I'm like, I mean, it's probably good, but I also don't want to give Disney more of my money because I don't agree with a lot of their business practices and what they're doing. So I kind of want your guys' thoughts on how Disney is headed.
Okay, well, first, specifically, could you identify a business practice that you find less than ideal?
It has become very much a monopoly, I think, and Disney owns a lot more companies and brands than I think people are aware of, right? Because Disney owns Fox.
Right.
Right, like that's a big thing in all of these big mergers. And one thing I also am not a fan of is their restriction on creative liberties when they buy new companies to do films for. I would have really liked to see how Marvel Studios just went without any Disney support. Of course, I know that a lot of money came from Disney, and that's what made a lot of it possible. And people love Marvel films. Hot take, not a fan of most of them. I don't think they're very
No, I actually agree.
good. But also specifically with Lucasfilms and how they've taken the new Star Wars trilogy. That being said, I haven't seen Episode 9, but I don't think it's going to be that good. My hopes aren't high for it.
One thing I can say is that with that, there was a lack of direction given to the new trilogy, and so it's very hard. Like, it was obvious from Force Awakens to The Last Jedi how you had a totally different director with what J.J. Abrams left off, but obviously there weren't like a whole lot of plans for like what he intended with that. So Rian Johnson just took that and like, okay, I'm going to figure out what I want to do with this. Not a whole lot of direction.
In fairness, J.J. Abrams is famous for his ambiguous direction.
Yes,
so, I don't know.
that's true.
The classical question that has to be posited in the case of something like Disney is, the small business versus monopoly question, right? In which, like, it's a debatable point as to whether or not having a monopoly is a good thing or a bad thing.
Right.
Because the plus side about, functioning with a monopoly is the fact that they have enough money and enough, like, weight to throw around that they can throw everything against the wall, right? Like, theoretically, they could try anything and everything. But also, monopolies are more likely to play it safe, right? Because like they already have a system that works and they have a model that makes them money. And so, generally speaking, and I think we've seen this definitely with Disney as time has progressed and it's gotten bigger, you see less like experimentation and less risk-taking in the artistic models, right? Which is something that, like, to Talon's point, that Marvel Studios, for example, was really good at in its early days of filmmaking, was like being really crazy with its experimentation, going in new artistic directions, that now that it's been bought out, debatably, it's lost some of that. I think that's the case.
Another thing I think is like with the risk taking and like they've played it more safe, they've also done that to some extreme points. So there's this one Disney policy that they have for their artists that is very, very hush-hush. Like, not a ton of people know about it. It's not widespread. But rather than for most companies, it's like they pay you to do art. When you're an artist for Disney, they pay you, and rather than having you work on specific things, any art you produce during that time is theirs. So, like, if you go home, you paint Picasso, like, you paint something, that's Disney's. They own that. So they own completely all of the things that you produce while you work for them.
Which is interesting why anyone would then want to work for them, especially artists, right? Because from what I know about people who are artists, they're very proud, but they're also very self-conscious about their work, right? Mm-hmm. But monetizing and keeping the rights to your own work is like crucial to any art, right? So it's interesting to me that people would willingly sign up to have all of the art that they produce in a certain time period just not be theirs.
See, but okay. The historical thing that I would bring up here is the case of like Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, right? So like when Walt Disney was first creating, and he was like in his early animation days, he created this rabbit that I don't remember what company he was working for, but he was an animator for the company. And so he designed Oswald, and then they took him and they started using him in all of these early cartoons. And then Disney left the company and started working on his own stuff, and he tried to use Oswald the Lucky Rabbit in his own animations, and the company told him that he couldn't do that because he had produced it for their company, and thus he was their property.
Right.
And so that's why he created Mickey Mouse, is because he was like, well, fine, I'll create something that's slightly different and call it my own. Ha-ha! Right?
Which has its own symbolism and stuff we can talk about there.
Yeah.
Right. So, I don't know. From a business standpoint, it does sort of make sense that you would want your artists to produce stuff that you can monetize.
Right.
Right.
And I don't really have any problem because, like, video game artists are the same way, right? They get paid to create art for a project that is owned by the company. But what is different about Disney, from what I understand from Zane's point, is that art that they produce on their own time then becomes Disney's.
Yes.
Right? I would be completely fine with it because you've got to pay artists and commission artwork for any animation or any game or anything like that. So it's fine to me for a company to pay someone like, hey, while you're on the clock, what you draw is for this project. But my problem is, you're off the clock. I don't care what you draw. We get all of your work.
That's interesting. I haven't heard that before.
Yeah, I haven't heard that before.
Curious to see that followed up on, because, like, I don't know if you could enforce a policy like that, candidly. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, because if you don't, like, sign your work, or if you don't date your work, then how can a company come and say, aha, I see you produced this at this time, and therefore it's our property?
Right, and, I mean, maybe it's a contract-based thing to where they run on an honor system, and if they find out that you've created art that they don't know about, they can take legal action against you because of a contract that you signed.
I would definitely want to research that policy more,
yeah,
because I'm not familiar with it.
I'm not 100% sure on that.
Hesitant to comment on it without a level of familiarity.
I wouldn't be surprised to see it go either way, but I have heard that before.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting, if that is true, one plus about it is that, well, Disney, like, is kind of like the epitome of, like, cartoonish kind of stuff. I guess not really, like, all things cartoonish, but it's a place where people can go to, like, really learn how to improve their talent. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one thing that people would be willing to trade for having all the art that they produce during that time be owned by Disney's. Hey, I'm learning really good stuff here. It's fine if all the art I made is owned by Disney. But there's a lot of negatives to that, too.
And then going along with that, like, possibly maybe they think of it as a training period where it was like, artists there's a stereotype that they're unemployed all the time. Like, artists is not really a sure job. So maybe going to Disney and trading, like, you can become a big time animator, like, because you can create these characters and then you can go work out for yourself and go find other employment. Would definitely be an option that I'd be willing to take, just like as a security measure, and then once I'm like more set up.
Well, but that's getting into divergent theories of art then, like as an abstract concept, because the question is, if you produce it for commercialization, you know, producing it with the knowledge that the company can use it to make money, and that is why they are commissioning you, then is it really art? Mm-hmm. Right? Or is there some like broader definition of that? There's a famous story about, there's this writer, his name is Harlan Ellison, back in the 50s, who he worked as an animator for Disney. Very briefly, he was hired, and he started drawing pictures of like classical cartoon characters like Jiminy Cricket doing very inappropriate things, and was fired a week later, right? Which is understandable from a company policy standpoint, because of course you don't want that. But also, you know, is there something to be said for the artistic merit of the things that this man was creating outside of the commercial monetization of what he was producing? Also, would be fascinated to see what Disney has done with that artwork.
Yeah, I don't want to know. To that point, though, because I think just about everything has some form of art in it, right? Because art, to me, from a subjective standpoint, is just the creation of something, whether you enjoy it or not, right? Okay. So to your point about Jiminy Cricket and doing these inappropriate things, those still have artistic merit in my eyes. But, that company also has the rights to not run with it, not enjoy it, and not monetize it. And especially to not publicize it, because that probably would not have been a phenomenal thing for early Walt Disney, right?
And I think another thing is Disney has lots of secret projects. So a lot of art that artists could be producing could be inspired from that or actually directly related to the project. So they probably want control over that art to make sure that it doesn't leak or out to other people. So all that kind of speculation can be pretty dangerous.
I think also to the point of art is that it's so subjective that it's difficult to give a definitive answer to any question related to it, right? Which feels like a cop-out in me saying it, right? It's like, oh, well, it's subjective, so you don't have the right to talk about it, right? That's not what I'm really saying, but it's hard for anyone to definitively say whether something is good or bad because there's inherent value in artwork to someone.
So then I think how that relates directly to Disney as a corporation is back to what we're talking about monetization, right? And if you produce something not for the joy or purpose of producing it, but simply because it's a product, right? Is a product art? Which is a debatable point, right? Because Andy Warhol, back in the 70s, 80s, and 60s, 70s, and 80s, he produced a whole series of prints, which he classified as art that was literally just photographs of old paintings or, vague line drawings of soup cans, right? Which Warhol claimed, despite being commercially mass-produced, were still art because of his intention and his commentary. Right. And he was a strange man with some eccentric characteristics to begin with. But, the point itself, I think, still stands of the question becomes, if you produce something commercially, if you mass produce it, which is what Disney does, right? They mass produce artistic themed products, especially when you get into things like action figures and coloring books and tablecloths and all of the other stuff that's a byproduct of the films themselves. Is that art? Is a frozen tablecloth art?
I mean, I think so, right? Because you have an artist behind it that's creating that work. It might not be the same art as something that Van Gogh produces or something that, traditional artists produce. And I think it does lose a lot of its artistic value when it becomes mass-produced for the enjoyment of whatever.
But why do you think that is, though?
Why does it lose its value the more that
why would mass production cheapen the value of art?
Because it's less unique.
Okay.
Right? And again, that's a weird thing to say that, the less pieces of a particular artwork are more valuable than... if we took Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh and we produced 50 of those copies in the beginning, he drew 50 of them, would those have any less value? But also now we have a million different versions and pictures and photos and renditions that we can go and see. So does that also cheapen the value of...
I don't think it does. I don't think the copying of that kind of art would... It's if anything, it brings it out to more people. More people are able to see it. I think the idea of the frozen tablecloth is that you're taking something that was originally made for a movie, one kind of art form, and you're using it as hey, because lots of people know what this is, I'm going to have this monetized as another thing.
Right, but then how is that different from the Starry Night example, right? Is a Starry Night tablecloth art? Right? Because it then becomes that same question. The fact that it's been mass-produced does mean, yes, that objectively it is less unique by sheer grace of the fact that more of them exist now. There's more copies of the likeness of this painting.
So I would say on that point, with the Starry Night example, I would say mass produced, taking pictures, you can look it up online and see it. I would say that does not cheapen the value, because I would say with art, the value is in the originality and the original idea. So Van Gogh made this piece and it's the only piece in existence. Well, we can have copies of it. I would say it does not cheapen the work. Whereas if he had made 50 of the same painting, that would cheapen the work, I would think.
Okay.
So then, again, what is the difference between that and the idea behind the tablecloth, right? Because there has to have been an artist that was hey, I want to take these characters that already exist, but I want to put my own spin on it, and I want to make it this way, right? So
I just want to make a tablecloth.
Right. So that brings up the question then, is art tied to the artist, and is that why we like it, or is art tied more to culture and we have more appreciation?
Yeah. So I have a thought about that. One of my favorite authors is Agatha Christie, and she specialized in murder mysteries. She was a writer like from the 1920s into like the 1950s. She's amazing and wonderful. Recently, she passed away a long time ago, but recently there has been this other author who, like, the Agatha Christie estate authorized this other author to write books under the Agatha Christie name, and they are released under the Agatha Christie label. And I haven't read any of them, candidly, because I think that that's not cool, right? Because the whole point about Agatha Christie as a writer is that it's her work, right? And, like, there are certain things that you come to recognize and certain things that I've come to expect and to enjoy reading her books that just cannot be the same simply by grace of the fact that it's not the same person writing.
Right.
You know, and so in that same way, you know, even if we're talking about like different animators or different painters or any kind of artist that takes this original concept or this original style and then says, I can do that as well, and tries to directly mimic it, is that art?
Yeah, does that make it any less artistic? Because, like, in a sense, we can get super philosophical here and say there's an art to imitation.
Right,
right,
and
because
great artists steal, right? Like,
right.
That's the whole shtick. Is there even original thought? Which is a whole other episode, I'm sure. But, you know, yeah, end of thought.
So I would agree with Calvin that, like, the value comes from, I would argue, more of the artists themselves and what they produce, rather than, like, what is produced itself. Because, like, with, like, the Agatha Christie example, like, if Vincent van Gogh has produced this painting and someone makes a tablecloth about it, like, we love Vincent van Gogh because of his original plot's ideas, like, how he saw the world, whereas, like, a tablecloth, like, that's monetized, like, well, like, it's just a stolen idea, but it's not the original, and it's not, like, the tablecloth, like, even putting his own spin on it, like, that's not
right.
the art.
And yet
almost
still,
like, could be like considered a sequel almost, not like literally a sequel, but like it's taking a different idea, you're having your own spin on it, but it's for like it's a different.
But still, like if you look at like a Starry Night tablecloth, you can look at it and go, "Oh, I love Vincent van Gogh."
Yeah.
Right, because like you recognize it and you understand what's behind it. In the same way that you could look at a Frozen tablecloth and go, "I love Frozen," which I hope everyone does.
I think to that point as well is that art is inevitably tied to a culture that we have built around it.
Okay.
Right? Because the culture we have around, using the same example, Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night, we're taught literally in school, this was a phenomenal artist, this was his magnum opus, right? This was the crux of his life. He went crazy afterwards, blah, 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 right? But we talked about Vincent van Gogh in school.
Right.
We don't talk about the value of frozen tablecloths in school. And that might sound weird for me to say, but I think that comes a little bit to the point of we believe what we're kind of told to believe, right? We're kind of told, hey, this is classic artwork. This is very famous classic artwork. As opposed to, that's the millionth frozen tablecloth that I've seen, and no one told me to like it, so I can actually make my own opinion about
There's
it.
There's a lot of perception behind art, for sure.
Right, and tying this back to Disney then, right? Mm-hmm. Disney has built up such a brand of like producing good movies and having all of these classics behind it. And so when Disney releases a new film, it makes everyone sit up, right? And go, oh, it's another Disney film.
Right.
Right? In the same way that someone might sit up and go, oh, it's another Van Gogh painting. Mm-hmm. Right? And does that have inherent value? Like, because it comes from the Disney brand, does that make it inherently more valuable than something produced by another artist or another company?
So what I think is interesting about that is, how does the remake films, like the live-action remakes, impact the classics?
Yeah.
With that idea going.
I think that Disney's brand does them so much good. Does them so much good. And they've worked so hard to get it where it is, right? Mm-hmm. Walt Disney's idea of animation being the first to start that blew up into literally one of the largest companies in the world that has arguably one of the largest impacts on our lives and how we view the world, right? Because those are representations of how people see the world. But the scary part about that too, and I'm kind of sidetracking from Wesley's point, but the scary part about that to me is that gives Disney a lot of power over controlling people's thought. And that sounds very conspiratorial to me. But I also kind of like am scared that Disney will like start sliding in like themes that people can pick up, and they don't really realize that they're being kind of conditioned to think away. And whether Disney is doing that on purpose or just for the sake of, you know, what's popular, I think that it has the potential to be super, super unhealthy.
So I would agree with that. I think like with some of their themes, like huge controversy over Finding Dory because they had a lesbian couple one scene, like not focused on, just like huge controversy. So like, but if you think about it, like Disney sliding in these themes, like this is okay, which like arguably it is, and like in the world, that's a whole nother discussion.
Right. So
like,
the question becomes, you know, because like one of the biggest things about art that centers around storylines is stories are so rooted and predicated in the human experience that to see characters who are reflective of ideas that are not our own is a little jarring sometimes, but also, you know, like in the case of having a lesbian couple in a show, there are lots of lesbians in the world and people who generally feel very underrepresented in art, right? And because art is rooted in the human experience, and I would argue should be very heavily rooted in the human experience, then I don't think that it's a sinister motive to say we want to show like lesbian people existing, you know, because to not have that in art is to a certain extent deny the lived human experience of people who live different human experiences than we do.
Right. And I would agree with that. And ultimately, Disney does have the right to put whatever they want in their shows, right? To a degree. Like, if they want to reach the audience, if they want to keep their brand, they have parameters that they have to stay in to keep people happy, right? Mm-hmm. But they are a private, independent company that can promote whatever they want. And to your point about the lesbian couple in Finding Dory, I agree with Calvin that is fine. And I'm completely okay with that because not to do that denies the existence of something, right? And whether you agree with that is a completely different thing, but Disney has the right to do it. But my thought was more along the lines of dehumanizing ideas, desensitizing us to ideas, and alienating certain groups of people for maybe the sake of promoting something that isn't realistic.
Okay. What is not realistic? Like, what do you have an example of something that's unrealistic that would be promoted?
I would say I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about forced diversity here, and I am going to take a step into some water that is probably pretty uncomfortable, and I admittedly probably should know more about. But my big fear comes in alienating certain groups of people in favor of promoting other certain groups of people.
Okay. Yeah, so Disney as a company has a long and storied history of not generally being on the right side of things like racial divides. There's a number of movies that they put out, especially in the 30s and 40s, that have very uncomfortable stereotypes, especially towards African Americans and Asian Americans. Mm-hmm. And it's very, like, horrendously uncomfortable to watch nowadays. So I think the simple fact of the matter is Disney has always existed in a space, as most artists do, of, you know, like growing up and, you know, Disney growing up like basically like a human being, right? Growing up in a cultural construct that is predisposed towards the alienation of certain groups. And the question then becomes, how do you combat that, right? And I don't have an answer for that, but I think that one way to combat the alienation of certain groups is to be as all-inclusive as possible. Right? Like, and to try to talk across cultural constructs and, you know, like, acknowledge that there are people who live and think differently than we do, without saying, simply because you live and think differently, you are better or worse.
Right.
Like, I don't... what brings to mind me is the scene in Endgame where they had to me, it felt really forced when they had, like, the woman power scene, like, trying to bring the gauntlet to the van or something like that. Like, it felt super forced and kind of uncomfortable, and I thought it could have been done a lot better in how it was just, it didn't feel natural.
That scene in Endgame that Wesley was just talking about, with how it felt very forced to have all of the female superheroes there. I will say, actually, I was very impressed because I did not notice that they were all female superheroes until my dad pointed it out to me. And that is something that I will give Disney credit for because they passed it off in a way that I didn't even notice it, right? Which, to our point earlier, that can kind of just be a medium for them to normalize things that maybe people don't agree should be normal. Again, they have the right to do that, right? But I was very impressed that because I like to think that I can pick those things out of a film.
Sorry, guys, we had some technical difficulties, but we're back now. So going back to Endgame and talking about like, the all-woman scene. So that's I'm not sure I made a very good point earlier with the lesbian example, but I want to make the same point. Like, I support women, like lesbian, like all that stuff. Like, I'm fine with like what Disney's choosing to do. My fear is like, what will they eventually choose? Like, they're spreading like feminism, like they're like choosing those things, and like I support women, like all of this stuff. Like, I agree 100%, and they're like, I'm glad they're choosing to spread that. My fear is like, what will they choose to spread in the future?
Like, what could it grow into, and could it grow into something that is, adamantly...
And what I want to say is, with my point with what I felt was forced, I think if they can go with make up movies that have, like, really good storytelling, but that have those kind of elements where it's, like, not as used, like, parts of society... for diversity, if you have a really good story and it's not just like, hey, just push a political agenda, but hey, let's actually tell a story of someone that's struggled through this. I think that's something that's way more meaningful, and if they go that route, I'm not as nervous, but there's other routes.
I can understand what you're saying. However, that's making one big inherent assumption, which is that all stories do not have some form of political agenda. Which isn't to say, stepping back into art theory for a moment, the question isn't necessarily like, does this story actively promote being a Democrat or a Republican? Because most don't.
Right.
But the question then becomes, like, what are you saying with this piece of art, right? Which is in and of itself slippery territory because, does art have to mean something? Does art have to say something? And in the case of, like, Disney films, I would argue that a quintessential part of good storytelling is diversity. And in the sense of, because people live diverse experiences, right? I'm not even necessarily talking like inherently racial diversity or gender diversity, but I'm talking about like diversity of background and diversity of thought. And sure, yeah, gender and ethnic diversity as well, right? Because we don't live in a vacuum in which good stories only happen if told through one perspective.
Right. I think... to Wesley's point more, and I agree with everything that you just said, because in order for a story to be good, it has to make you feel something, right? And whether that's something that you agree with or something that you disagree with is dependent on whoever's watching the film, right? Because my perspective on that all-women scene is going to be different from someone who identifies more closely with the groups and parties involved, right? Yeah. So it's hard for me to say, hey, that was a bad choice, I didn't like it, Disney, don't ever do that again, right? But to Wesley's point, I think all of that comes off way better if you start from a grounds of having a good story and wanting to tell a good story about those people instead of the other way around, right? Where you take those people and you force write a story around them, which sounds almost like the same thing.
I feel like
I'm kind of talking in a
boxes
circle.
Instead of like, hey, I actually want to make something.
So define a good story. What makes a good story?
I mean, to your point earlier, it's something about the human experience.
Okay.
Right? And something that people can identify with. And stories can be good that you don't agree with.
Yes.
Right? And again, to Wesley's point, I think personally, to me, it makes a much better story if they table forced diversity and focus on creating a work of art instead of pushing a political agenda. And I'm not sure if I'm phrasing that in the way that I wanted to
I can understand
across.
what you're saying. So there's this classical question when like writing or creating a piece of art that is, how hard do you try to say something or mean something?
Right.
Right? And like speaking as someone who's written a handful of plays and done related projects, there have been times when I as a writer have reached a point where I'm like, I'm trying too hard to push an agenda. Maybe not maybe not an explicitly political one,
right?
But like I'm trying to say something and I'm trying to make this mean something, and it tanks the story, right? And the trick with that is then finding the balance between like, like what I think of is, I remember I had a conversation with my mom a long time ago, back before any of the Black Widow trailers had come out or anything like that. And we were talking about Avengers, and my mom is like, I'm disappointed there isn't a Black Widow movie. And I was like, why? And she's like, well, because the thing of it is, when you watch the Avengers, what do you see? You see all of these like Herculean men who sure are flawed and sure like have other stories around them. But it's like all of these men with big egos and big heads and big hearts who then go and save the world. And she's like, there's none of that for the women. Black Widow makes this like brief appearance, and she's like dressed all sexy, and and yes, she is still a hero of the story, and that is made clear. However, The story is about the men and how the men function in the society, and not about the women except as love interests. And so she's like, as a woman, I watch that and I go, why are there not women heroes as well? Right? Because that to me is not a good story because it's not evocative of my human experience. You know, and there is something to be said still for the subjectivity of that, right? Because, like, certain people will feel that certain stories are better than others and certain pieces of art are better than others based on their lived experience. But I think that there is still something to be said for the fact that many times, especially, you know, in the context of Disney, which, again, has a tendency to, like, focus more on the experiences of, like, homogenous white male Americans, because it has a tendency to focus on that, then it also has a tendency to inherently exclude the stories of people who live different experiences than that. And I don't think that it's inherently a bad thing to then say, we have excluded these stories for so long, now let's look at those instead of this one other central narrative.
Which is where I think Disney is going, right? And I would agree with that. But again, there's so much of that because of my lived human experience thus far that I don't pick up on.
Yes.
Right? And there are also other things that I pick up on that I don't think other people pick up on.
For sure.
And one of the things that I want to point out here really quick is the case where you're talking about it's, you know, a bunch of Hercules men and whatnot, but you also made the comment that, you know, Black Widow is dressed up, you know, sexy and is hero of the story and is more of a love interest in kind of her earlier appearances in the movies, right? And what is always interesting to me is that that's a two-way street, but it hardly gets recognized. And I'm not coming to this from a table of, you know, I feel victimed or anything because of that, but the men are dressed up just as sexy. They've got to be banging hot dudes, right? So that idea kind of goes both ways, but I think we tend to focus on one. And again, I'm not saying this as a point of like, oh, you know, woe is me, I'm not a hot, sexy dude, so that there's something evil about that. But I think to that point of I just think that goes both ways, right?
And that comes to a different point about, like, the aggrandization of storytelling, especially in superhero movies, right? Like, and we've talked a handful about Marvel, but I was reading an article recently that details how the author is making the argument that superheroes are like modern Greek gods. Right? Like, semi-human figures that we look to as pinnacles of how to act or how not to act based on narratives that have been constructed around our societal values. Which was a fascinating thing and, like, could talk about for hours. So interesting. But to your point, yes, I do think that both men and women, especially in superhero films, have this tendency to be portrayed as, like, sometimes overly sexualized or sometimes overly, like, heroized, right? Because when we go for entertainment, we want to be able to step outside of the uncomfortableness that is lived human experience. And the easiest way to do that is to create superhuman figures.
Right. And I think to your point about Greek gods and how superheroes are kind of the modern of that, I think a lot of people are starved for positive role models. And whether or not the superheroes you consider are positive role models is something different, right?
Right.
But people want something to look up to, and what better of a thing to look up to than Thor, who is a literal god, Captain America, who is literally supposed to be an embodiment of what America is like, also jacked and hot. Iron Man, right? Classic, you know, super big brain, big ego, has a good character arc, right? All of these people that are so much larger than our lives are what people look to.
Yes.
But those characters can also be used in a sense, like you said earlier, to tell us how to think, to tell us how to act, and to tell us what is right and
also
wrong.
Key to an earlier point is, like, what's the one common theme about all of the people that we just talked about? Iron Man and Thor and Hulk and Captain America. All wonderful role models, sure. Also all male.
Right.
Right? And so, you know, you look at, I mean, again, we're talking, like, generally exclusively about superhero films. And interestingly, Disney has made more of a push, which I would argue is favorable towards having films lately, like animated films especially, that have, like, strong female protagonists. You know, you have stuff like The Princess and the Frog or Moana, right? Which center around having strong female characters because artistically our society's lacking in that. And yes, I agree with you 1,000% that, like, one of the best things about art, especially in the sense of, like, film and entertainment, is that it can give us positive role models. But it's a completely different experience if you're, like, a little boy watching Captain America and you're like, wow, that's amazing and I can be that someday maybe, versus being a little girl watching that and being like, biologically I cannot be that someday.
Right. And I think Disney is making, like you said, a lot of an effort to kind of change that. And I think that's where a lot of people have a problem with Disney coming up, right? Is because I didn't think Captain Marvel was a particularly good film. I don't think Brie Larson was the proper casting choice. I thought she acted very poorly, and I thought the writing for it was pretty horrendous. That being said, the push to have strong female protagonists is real. My problem, particularly with Captain Marvel as a female role model, is that her character happened too quick. And that's just me analyzing the film. And of course, my lived human experience is different from everyone else's, so how you interpret this is up to you. But I don't feel like she earned the power that she had. And maybe there's some weird time skip stuff that goes on, but I just don't feel like her character arc to get her where she was as good as Thor's, as good as Hulk's, as good as Captain America, as good as Iron Man.
I feel the same way about someone like Iron Man, though. That, like, is just a snotty, privileged guy who happens to have this traumatic life experience that induces him to go and, like, pursue these superhero-like powers.
Right.
Right? But it's... I don't know.
I have a hot take on Captain Marvel. I actually enjoyed the movie until the very part where, like, she becomes absolutely overpowered. Like, I really liked how she had that struggle that's introduced throughout the whole movie, her flashbacks to trying to figure out what her past was like. And I found that really interesting. I'm just afraid that they felt that because it was flawed, that people would think it's not as good, and so they switched the overpowered part at the end to have that really big ending. So my fear is that people won't be able to show the flaws and, like, the positive role models for women, and just be forced to, like, make them, like, bigger than life than what they actually need to be. I don't know if I worded that correctly.
Yeah. And my problem, again, with Captain Marvel isn't that she's powerful. It's just how undeserved it felt for me for her to get to that power so quickly, right? And to your point about Iron Man, I would agree, but he didn't take down an alien invasion in his first movie. Right? I will say that. Like, he fought terrorism. He definitely got larger than life really, really fast. And his character arc, whether you like it or not, I thought was very good and developed a good character that in the end, I actually started to like him. Because I hated him at first. But at the end, when, like, right at the end, in Endgame and Infinity War, I started to like him a little bit more. But with Brie Larson's character, it didn't make sense to me that she had earned that place. And maybe that's how it was in the comics. Because I didn't...
of this comic, probably. Like,
right, because it totally could have just followed the comic. But I just thought it was a little bit extreme that we got 2 hours of Captain Marvel, and at the end of that, she's the most powerful person in the MCU.
And maybe it's like how you said you hated Iron Man at the start, right? Maybe we're just starting with that with Captain Marvel. Like, it's probably going to have to progress, give it some time. Because she really did only get one movie, and she's been pretty minimal appearances in Endgame. So
right. And I also want to kind of throw this out here, is that I'm not attacking her being overpowered because she's a woman, right? I would feel this way about any character who got overpowered really quick, or at least I would like to think that I would feel this way about any character, right?
Yes, and I sympathize with that. I just think inherently the tricky part about all of us being men in this room is that because we don't come from a female lived experience, it's difficult, not impossible per se, but very difficult for us to be able to understand precisely what it means, which is why, like, this conversation with my mom about Black Widow all of those years ago, like, opened my eyes in a way that I didn't anticipate,
right? And
that I'm only now coming to fully realize of this would never have crossed my mind, you know. And tying that back to Disney, right? The thing about Disney as this multi-billion-dollar corporation is it has the power to force these conversations, right? Which I would argue is a good thing, but that is an arguable point. Right? And that any one corporation can have such power that we're even talking about how they can generate role models for an entire generation of people is a big deal.
Right.
Which, going back to kind of what Talon said, like, backtracking a little bit, I agree with both Talon and Kelvin. Like, I didn't like Captain Marvel, but I also didn't like Iron Man. Like, even in the end, like, he grew on me more, but I still was definitely not his biggest fan. Which is why I'm excited for the Black Widow movie, because I feel like even in, like, Avengers, even in Winter Soldier, like, I connected more with Black Widow, because, like, her background was questionable. Like, her background was threatened, like, when she had to expose S.H.I.E.L.D. and Hydra to the world. Like, her background was threatened, and I'm excited to see where that's coming from. But also, like, I feel like in the world today, like, that kind of happens to women. Like, you see a lot of, like, political men, and, like, not per se, like, it's exclusive in women. I think it's a little bit more prevalent, but, like, political men with, like, that have, like, bad stuff, like, in their past get away with it more commonly than women do. Like lately it's starting to change more, but I think definitely, like, 10, 15 years ago even, like, it was definitely not the same. Whereas, like, if a woman ran for office and something from her past came about, like, it was, like, that
You're
ended,
gone.
yeah, she's not going to make it. Whereas, like, a man, it'd be, oh, like, this happened.
Yeah, and clearly that hasn't changed too terribly much.
Right. And to kind of pull this back to movies a little bit, I also am excited for the Black Widow movie, because I have become invested in her character over time. And to me, I think her character being almost like a secondary character in a lot of the films has made me like her, right? Because instead of, the way that I watch films is that really, instead of looking at the main character, I like looking at the supporting cast and the role they play in the main character's life, right? Because the first time we see Black Widow is in Iron Man 2.
Something like that.
Right?
Yeah.
And the role she plays in that is fairly minimal, but you know she's up to something.
Right.
And you know that she's a spy by the end of the movie, right? Which is a very valuable character trait. That's one of her only character traits as far as how they utilize her character, right? Is that she's a spy, this is the skill set she has. But it also alludes to all of this background stuff. Like, what did actually happen in Budapest, right? Stuff that we don't know. And I think it has done her character a lot of good to kind of go through this, she's a spy, so we're not going to give her really her own movie, because that's not as riveting as saving the world, right? It's just kind of spy espionage stuff. But I think it did her character a lot of good to make so many appearances and so many suggestions and to support so much in everyone else's character development that she has gotten to a place where I'm interested in her character.
And from a plot building standpoint, yes, I agree, right? Like having characters that just float in the background until all of a sudden they're thrust to the forefront. But again, the critical difference here is like Thor, for example, made like one appearance in one Marvel movie, and then all of a sudden, bam, he has 5-6 billion feature-length films about him.
Right.
Right? Whereas Black Widow had made like 5 appearances in other Marvel films before they even considered giving her a movie.
Right. And I think that actually just kind of came down to what made money.
And I agree, candidly, because, you know, again, Disney is a corporation. The corporation's job is to make money and to continue making money regardless of inherent social trends.
Right.
And so, yeah, it makes sense. And it's, you know, now that the social trend is leaning more towards we want more women protagonists, Disney's like, time to capitalize on that, right? Which, from a business standpoint, makes sense. From an artistic standpoint, I think it's very stupid.
Right. And kind of on this point of art that I just kind of thought is that art, I think, gets a lot of its value from being contrarian. Especially as time progresses, right? Art that criticizes something will become famous when that something is widely criticized by society, right? So as time kind of progresses, these pieces of art that weren't popular at the time become popular because of what they criticized and how society has changed to kind of envelop that idea of what that art
There's an
has
old
done.
saying that says art imitates life, but the thing about art imitating life is that art tends to come first.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
I like that.
I think another thing about Black Widow, like, we talk about her being a secondary character, and, like, I think she was more powerful, like, a mover for me. I'm definitely glad to have her as the primary character now, but I think she was more powerful and in a better stance to move people towards women. Like, you look at, like, Captain Marvel, like, her movie was not the best, like, in my personal opinion, and it wasn't super popular, but, like, she was just, like, given her power straight up, like, didn't do anything to earn it. Whereas, like, you look at Black Widow, she still doesn't have, like, superhero power. She doesn't have a suit. She doesn't have super strength. Like, none of that. Like, what, like, she ends up sacrificing her life in Endgame for, like, the purpose, and, like, everyone loves her at that point. And I think just the story of, like, I think a lot of lower class Americans that, like, start out with nothing. Like, you look at, like, Thor, like, oh, he's so great, he has superpowers, but he was also born with them, and he didn't really do anything to deserve them in the first place. Whereas Black Widow, like, she doesn't have any superpowers. Everything she has, like, she's super great fighter, like, strong, pretty smart. Like, what she's done, she's had to work hard for that, and I think that goes along with the point, like, that is, like, has really resounded with me.
Which I think is essentially symbolic, too, right? Because, like, most of the male superhero characters are either born into their powers or have them, like, blasted upon them in some flash of radiation or a spider bite, right? Whereas Black Widow has to just work her butt off, right? And that's, I think, speaks volumes about, like, societally how men come from a position that is generally stronger than women, right? And that, I mean, clearly in the case of Black Widow, she has to work twice as hard for half the result.
Right. And I have really enjoyed Black Widow's character throughout the entire MCU because the first time I saw her was in the first Avengers movie. And I was like, I don't know who this fool is. By the end of the movie, I was like, oh, okay, I can get on board. It's another member, didn't have any superpowers, right? Which was something that stuck out to me, like in that scene in the first Avengers where they're all in the circle in that New York City square and the camera pans around to all of them and Thor's got like his hammer and Hulk like bangs his chest and Cap's got his shield and Iron Man shows up in his armor and you've got Hawkeye with his dope bow and she just pulls out like a 9mm. And I'm like, that's a rough fight. She's not positioned well to handle an alien invasion, but she ends up being the one who closes the portal. Right, playing a super critical supportive role, which I think has always been Black Widow's character. Maybe not in the sense of how Disney and the MCU has used her as a character, but how her as a person actually is, and how her personality actually is. But they use that to make her more and more and more and more and more of a prominent character. Because by Endgame, she's basically the ringleader, right? So she's worked hard and she's gotten to this point, which makes me identify with it a lot more because it's so much more human.
Like if you look at Endgame, when you start out in the like MCU, like with the first like series of the Marvel Studios movies, like it's all about like Iron Man's the leader, like Captain America's the leader, like all these male heroes taking the roles. But then you go to Endgame and you look and you see like Ant-Man has disappeared from existence, comes back. Tony has basically given up hope and he's living his life. Captain America's trying to do his best, but not really being crazy successful. Like Hawkeye has gone off, like he's killing people in revenge, and like Thor has become like this drunk rather than like the hero we once knew. It's like drunk. Like all of those heroes have fallen, and like Captain America, I think was still like fairly good, but like you see Black Widow, who's like, like half the people are gone. You failed, like. I think she didn't give up because I think in her past she had failed more. Like you look at Thor, like in none of until Infinity War, I don't think in really any Avengers movie ever they had ever like failed a mission, like failed like the big task. Where I think is like Black Widow growing up from like she had to work for everything she had. She was more exposed to the failure, and I think that's what makes her such a strong character. Is that like they're exposed to failure and they give up. They don't have the grit. They don't have the persistence to keep working. Whereas Black Widow's like, what are you doing? I'm going to get to work. Like she ends up running everything. Like she's doing her best.
That's
like,
good storytelling. Like I didn't even really realize that. Like till you just mentioned like how all the male characters kind of fell, but the women characters kept fighting. I didn't even notice that. And that's to me good storytelling.
And how what to me is really good storytelling about that is that it doesn't necessarily predicate on the idea that she's a female. It predicates on the idea of her lived experience, which definitely had something to do with her being a female, right? But that is something that I really have enjoyed about her character, is that her getting to a point where she hasn't been exclusively because she's female, right? She's had to work, and she's been situated in a way to where it's more difficult for her, of course, right? We all agree on that point. But again, what you're saying, her life surrounded or revolved a lot around failure. She's failed missions before. Her upbringing was super difficult, and that grit came from her lived experience more than I think being a female. Not that being a female didn't contribute to that lived experience. Yeah, if that makes sense.
No, but your point is well taken.
Which I think like that's where like we're talking about like we like criticized like some like the role in Endgame where they have like the completely female superhero group and stuff like. And I think maybe that's the place where it needs to be is like Black Widow, where it's not like, oh, it's all about females and like this big like feminism moment. Is more of like, what can we do to like just portray this in a way? Like you like Wesley said, he didn't notice that before. He didn't notice how like strong of a role she had played. But I think it definitely hit more subconsciously than it did like at the forefront with the with the scene of she's got help and
I also, part of what I have kind of come to think about this whole thing is that intellectual diversity is more valuable to me than racial or ethnic diversity. Now those two things, racial, ethnic, sexual, gender identity, all of those things play a role in how you intellectually pan out and what your personality is, right? But I think to me, it comes down from qualifications and lived human experience rather than the color of your skin.
But the trouble with that is that your lived human experience is inherently predicated upon the color of your skin or upon your gender identity.
Right. But it's not exclusive to that. And I think a lot of people think that it is exclusive and that's who that person is rather than their experience.
Okay.
If that makes sense at all to anyone.
I think that's a role that Disney could play in trying to break the expectations that you're stuck in what you're forced with, like what you're living with.
Right. So, yes, I definitely agree. But then, what things are people stuck and forced to live with? Like, what are examples of those things? Because, like, the first thing that comes to my mind is something like, okay, poverty, right? Like, characters rising from poverty. Okay, cool. Yeah, let's do that. Let's show characters who rise from poverty. But also, characters who are black who have to face a society that is, frankly, kind of loaded vaguely against them, right? That is also a circumstance that one must overcome. Right? Or like what we're talking about with these female superheroes and how they have to work significantly harder than the men to even achieve basic superpowers. Right? And so, like, I appreciate your point about intellectual diversity because, yes, I think that's very important. However, I don't see a separation between intellectual diversity and something like racial or ethnic or gender or sexual diversity.
I guess my idea is that intellectual diversity comes from lived human experience that all of these other forms of diversity play into.
Okay.
Right, but aren't exclusive to. Right, your intellectual diversity isn't exclusive to you being white or black.
So how do you break expectations of intellectual diversity, though?
What do you mean?
Like, correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding of what we're talking about as far as intellectual diversity is thinking about human experiences, lived human experiences that are different from our own. Right, like being able to conceptualize that, being able to think about different ideas and different worldviews and different political views. Am I understanding that correctly?
Right, yeah.
So then how do you do that? How do you make people consider alternative views?
I mean, you've got to portray them somehow.
Right, and that to me is the key point, right? Is that, that is where I don't see a separation between intellectual diversity and something like gender or ethnic diversity, is because in order to break through the inherent intellectual stigmas that we carry with us about like characters who live in poverty or characters of color or characters who are women or like characters who believe certain things, in order to break that gridlock of the intellectual blockchain that we find ourselves in, we need to see characters who live different experiences than that.
Right.
And so that is why I don't see a separation between them, because like I agree that there's like a bigger umbrella that they all fall under, but you can't chip away at that until you start showing things that are different.
And I think one thing that you maybe have accidentally done there, and I'm not meaning this to be rude in any way, but that I feel like that generalized a lot of groups of people.
Okay.
Right?
How so?
Into the sense that if they identify with one, we'll go with racial groups. We'll talk about racial groups for this example. That if you say you're black, that inevitably turns out to be how you think, right? You end up having
inextricably connected with how you live your human experience.
Right.
Yes.
And my question, maybe my misunderstanding here, is the assumption that they all live the same human experience and they all end up being intellectually almost the same, which I disagree with because I still think black people can be situated very, very differently.
That is very true.
Right. So a black person who is born into a wealthy family who is very privileged in an area where, that is something that is promoted, or heck, just isn't even an issue, is going to be way different from someone who grows up in an inner city, no money, raised in a gang.
Which is very true. Like I
Which
agree.
is where my idea of intellectual diversity comes in, is that those play a role in who you become, but everyone is situated so differently that it's hard to definitively say you think that way because you're black, or you think that way because you're a woman.
That's true. No, yeah, your point is well made. I think what I would say to that is the breadth of human experience is, to a point that you made earlier, much bigger than our racial or our ethnic or our gender identity or like any one specific identity. Like no human being is one thing and one thing only, right? You're never just a woman or a man or just black or just white, right? Like there's always something bigger than that.
Right.
And so the trick then with breaking out of intellectual gridlock and experiencing intellectual diversity is then experiencing the full breadth of all of these different human experiences. So like I would want to see a story about a black man born into wealth as much as I would want to see one about a black man born into poverty or a black woman born into poverty, or because there's so much at play there, right? Like there's at least 3 determining factors there that we're talking about, which is income and skin color and gender. Right? In which, like, I don't know, you can see very clearly that there are different experiences being lived there. And I think it's important that we are exposed to as many of those as possible.
Yeah, and I would agree, because I've spent, I would say, the majority of my life being very idealistic about how America runs those things, right? Because I do not want to believe, and I want to live in a bubble where everyone is actually treated the same. Everything is performative based. I'm not going to treat you any different, and no one's going to treat you any different because of your color, your background, your gender, or any of these things that people identify as. But the culmination of all of those things as far as character goes. Right. But the more that I have kind of developed and read literature and done a lot of research and been exposed to things, the less I realize the reality of that.
Which is then where, again, bringing it to Disney... Does Disney then, and I mean, this is sort of stepping into the psyche of the company, which maybe we shouldn't do, but I'm curious as to thoughts on this. Is it the role of a multi-billion-dollar corporation to say, we are going to create the things that expose you to different ideas, when they may, in fact, have nothing more in mind aside from profit margins?
Right. Or, to our point earlier, have something in mind to quote-unquote indoctrinate people.
Yeah, I don't know that I don't personally hold with indoctrination theory so much as I hold with, like, corporate theory of, it is, again, the job of a corporation is to make money.
Right.
So whatever it takes to make them that money, I think they will do, and I'm sort of pessimistic about that, candidly. So I don't know that they're trying to promote a specific brand of, like, this is how we shall think.
Right.
So much as what can we produce that people will want to come and watch that will make money, which is a mindset in and of itself.
Right.
So my thoughts on this are, like, I think Calvin's point about making money is, like, just where you two fall different. Like, with Disney, I think, like, their point is, like, to make money, and that's where they come in with, like, the women superheroes, like, the black superheroes. Like, I think that's where they're coming in, is because we, like, as a society, want more, or we're trying to push for more racial equality, more, like, gender equality and such. And I think, so that's where they're using that to make money, and I think that's where they come in. But then you see, like, and that's where your 2 different points of view come in, I think, is because when they do that, that brings up the point of, like how big of a role does that play? And I think that when a multi-billion-dollar corporation that has so much power and influence does that, I think it can either, like, and I see both effects here, it can either bring those groups together, or it can drive them even more separate.
Right.
So I think it either creates a divide or, like, creates unity, and that's what I'm seeing here, is, like,
right.
that.
So then the question becomes, which one of those things do we think Disney is more effective at accomplishing, dividing or uniting?
And what do we think their responsibility is to do?
Right. Because, like, I don't think there's anyone here, or hopefully not anyone out there, who would say that it's the job of a corporation to divide people.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So then, in what ways would a multi-billion corporation like Disney try to foster unity of, like, thought and purpose?
So what I'm thinking here is, like, it could either do both of them, like I said, like, foster division or foster unity. And either way, it's going to use those to make money. Like, if it fosters division and, like, the racial and, like, gender, like, they become more, like, separate, then they can use that to make money. We can, like, make movies geared toward these people that, like, the black people and, like, these more minorities will sympathize with and, like, will love, and, like, that will foster even more division possibly. And we can make ones that, like, rich white males, like, these are all stereotypical examples, but, like, we can make movies that, like, will foster them, and then we can make movies that both of them will want to see, whereas, like, we can unite them, and then we only have to, like, make one movie that will, like, generally promote the unity of them, and they'll come together on that. But I think Disney's gonna, like, continue making these movies, and however society chooses, because I think it's more about how society chooses to react to them rather than Disney's purposes itself.
Right.
No matter how society, like, Disney, like, has made these movies, and I think they're either going to unite or divide the country and, like, just, like, people in general. And no matter what, Disney can use that to make money. So I don't really think they, like, have a role or a care about that.
Right.
Like, hopefully we want all mankind to like promote the unity, but like Disney, I think, is more thinking of like, no
Just-
matter what, like,
yeah.
we can use this to make
This is going
money.
to sound kind of heartless of me, but I don't think that at that point a corporation has a conscience per se. Which isn't to say that it's like evil.
Right.
It's just to say that at that point the job isn't to determine what is
run by the
morally right or
numbers.
morally wrong. It's what makes money.
which
Right.
is what I'm thinking. Like, they're doing this, and rather than maybe gearing it towards unity and trying to push for that and using like their powers for good, they're just going to use their powers to make money. Like, they're just neutral, and whether it turns into good or evil is up to the people.
And I think to that point, it's very interesting that Disney has gotten to where it is, because if there's one thing that people can talk about, it's a Disney movie.
Right.
Right? If there's one thing people can talk about, it's the newest Marvel
Right,
movie.
because everybody
It's
wants
the
to go
newest
see
Star
the new
Wars
Star
movie.
Wars.
Because everyone wants to go see them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because of the brand that Disney has built, a brand of reliability, a brand of making at least mediocre movies.
Right.
Right? So it's interesting how maybe, to your point, is that Disney doesn't have a conscience, right? But we as a society are buying into something that ends up uniting us,
Right.
right? Which is kind of one of
Which
those
is that
underlying
this Star
things.
Wars movie is just going to be bad. Like that's the driving factor that unites. Be quiet, Wesley. We know you've seen the movie.
Right, and, that's the one common denominator that I have found in talking to anyone at school, basically, is, what are your thoughts on Star Wars? Do you think it's going to be good? Do you think it's going to be bad?
Right. Yeah.
What did you think about Black Panther? Was it a good movie? Did you like Captain Marvel? I thought Endgame was way overhyped. What did you think about it?
Right.
So
It
these are
stimulates
all
a
things
conversation.
that stimulate conversations for us
For
to talk
sure.
to people, no matter who that person is we're talking
Which then
to.
comes back to, again, like theories of art, because if it stimulates conversation, then yeah, sure, maybe that's art, right?
Right.
Like maybe that is the definition of art, is something creative that stimulates people to start critically thinking and talking, right? Whether you're like, let's talk about gender and ethnic identity, or whether it's like, hey, let's talk about how crappy that movie was.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
The fact that it spurs on conversation is, I would argue, a uniting thing.
And-
Right?
yeah.
Because as long as we take care to have intelligent conversations about whatever it is we're talking about, then I think that unites us way more than it divides us.
Right.
Which I agree. I think like that unites us, and that's, I think, maybe the direction that it's going. But then that also has the power to divide us. Like, what do you think about Endgame, or what do you think about the new Star Wars? Like, that's where like we see that kind of in politics right now. Is like they're becoming more polarized, and like right now I think we're going more towards like unity on this, but like that also has the potential to cause division, and like maybe it's stupid, but like if you get into an argument about like movies, like you could see people like break lifelong friendships over sports teams and such. Like people become so like attached to that, and maybe that's where movies go, is like that power of like this can either bring us unity, like two people talking, like if you see this in the movie The Pursuit of Happiness, where like they end up the main character and the CEO end up bonding over sports, and while the CEO doesn't change that leads the main character to be able to establish more connections and ultimately end up successful. And I think that maybe that's where this is going, is like it can either unify us or it can like seriously divide us.
I think that's the choice of the people.
Yep. Because again, it's the corporation job to make money,
Right.
and it's the people's job
people's
to
job to
react to
interpret,
it
yes.
and
Yeah.
interpret it, right? It's very fascinating the power that Disney has here,
Yeah.
right? And I think maybe we're giving Disney too much of the spotlight in a sense, because there are definitely other producers of movies
Oh, yeah.
that
Right.
talk about other things, and particularly things that focus more on maybe political agendas, maybe one certain kind of lived human experience, where Disney's job, and I think they found, is to provide something that is diverse so more people can
Right.
identify
Disney has
with
just
it,
sort of
right?
gotten to the point where they can just throw anything against the wall and it'll probably make money.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
Which is why I think that they were the first company that we thought to list on our random number generator, because, and I think that in and of itself speaks to the fact of why we're talking about Disney as opposed to like Fox Business Network, right? Because it has this brand and this history and this like culmination of all of this time and effort that it's put into building that brand and history that makes us think of it right away, because we've seen all of their films and we've grown up, like it's our childhood, and it's not only our childhood, but like the childhood of our parents and our grandparents and even our great grandparents, right, who grew up watching Disney films,
right?
And so it's this like common intellectual currency that we all have that other companies have with us as well, right? Like McDonald's is the first thing that comes to my brain, but
Right.
Disney, it's Disney's job to produce entertainment. right? And it does that and has been doing that pretty effectively for a solid almost century now.
Right. And what is fascinating to me too is that the success it's had particularly on me to make me think differently, right? In the sense of art, and in the sense of too is like not noticing problems that exist, right? Because like in Black Panther, I wasn't counting how many black people or white people there were. I was just watching the film because I thought it was good. I was enjoying it. I liked the villain. I literally could care less that there are only like 4 white people on the cast.
Yeah.
Right. Which is something that I think Disney has maybe accidentally promoted, right? Is kind of breaking down that barrier of, oh, you know, this movie is just about black dudes, right? Because it's not. That's not what it's about. And a lot of people, well, I can't say that's not what it's about because that ultimately is subjective.
Right.
Right. But to me, that's not what it was about. It was about the villain. It was about his intentions. But it definitely brought up those racial undertones right into the forefront.
It forces
right?
us to have these conversations.
And I think the general opinion on that was that it was people really enjoyed it, and they're going to make a sequel on it.
Yep.
And so I think that's like Zane's point on how it's pointing towards more unity, because if the first one went well, we liked it, we reacted well to it.
We spent money on it.
Let's do a second one.
Yeah. And that, too, going back, you know, Martin Luther King's famous quote is not by the color of your skin, by the content of your character. Right? And when we're talking literally about characters on the screen, I think that is way more valuable to me because, again, about that all-female scene in Endgame, I didn't notice it because I wasn't focused on gender. I was focused on character, and I was focused on what was happening. Again, in Black Panther, I wasn't focused on what color they were. I was focused on the character of the people who were being portrayed.
And I think that's where the unity comes in, is like when, like, back in, like, before the civil rights movement, if people had seen that movie, they would be like, that's all black guys, like, racist, like, whereas, like, now, like, you see Talon, who's, like, successfully, like, oh, I didn't even notice it, like, and that's where I think we as a society want to be, is where, rather than being like, oh, this is a movie about black guys, this is, like, an all-women scene, like, whereas it's just about the character.
Right.
Rather
the curious thing is that we still notice these things.
Yeah.
Right? Even if we're not, like, sitting in the movie theater like, I see this is a film about black people or a film about women. Like, we step back from it and we start having conversations about it and we're like, oh, okay, there's this thing that I didn't realize. Okay, they were trying to make a statement with this maybe, you know? And that to me is the value in having films, especially that are designed to break out of, like what Talon is talking about this intellectual gridlock that we inhabit, you know? In which we get to see experiences that are different from ours, and we can still relate to them, right? Which I think is really important, and what Disney is very good at, because it makes money when you make stuff that you can relate to.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I think, like, stepping back even from Disney, like, to the entertainment as a whole, I think, has become a great, like, factor of, like, promoting, like, actual unity. Like, and I say that, and, like, I think not only, like, as a corporation, but, like, if you're going and you're scrolling through memes, I think, like, earlier, like, decade of memes, like, earlier in the decade, you see these things that are, like, just make you laugh. Like, if Cinderella's shoe fit perfectly, how did it fall off? Like, that just makes you laugh. Whereas now, like, you look at the end of the decade, and the most popular types of memes are relatable memes. And I think that just goes to, like, we're unifying as a country, like, and, like, that's where this is going. Like, we're unifying, and it's not becoming, like, about
right, or at least art, you know, whether like epic films or memes, has the ability to unite.
Right. I think also is that it brings a lot of hope to me for our generation in particular, because I think a lot of these problems aren't necessarily time gated, they're just generationally gated, right? Because each new generation you're going to get is going to think differently.
Yes.
And the more and more progressive we get as a society with this entertainment industry that is putting out whatever ends up making money, ends up unifying and shaping how people think, right? Because of the world that we live in, we're exposed to so much media that inevitably we start to kind of mimic those trains of thoughts, and that's kind of how we learn how to think and all of these things. So I think, like, what is the world going to be like when we have kids who are watching potentially still Disney movies, right? Like, what are the ideas that are going to be promoted? Are we going to be completely behind this whole racial diversity thing? You know, are we going to get to a point to where it doesn't matter what matters is your character,
right? And it comes back to, I really liked the line that I developed earlier, so I'll reuse it about, you know, people say that art imitates life, but the art tends to come first,
right?
You know, which is where a company like Disney is in a unique position, right? And I can't say that it's concretely their job to promote any active agenda that will eventually come true, because I think that's stepping into weird territory. But I do think that because they are producing things that reflect how we think and in turn inflect how we think, then it puts them in that unique position of being able to change the world.
Right. Which also, again, going back to my whole conspiracy thing, can easily be propagandized. Because what will the world be like in 50 years? Will that racial diversity increase, and will that gap become larger? And then Disney ends up taking a side that makes them more money, that will vilify the other side. Are we going to have Disney as a corporation producing World War III propaganda?
They did produce World War II propaganda.
That's what I'm saying, right? It's because of their brand and their power and their influence, they have the potential to propagandize things, which is what I am partially afraid of.
And there is a lot more factors than just Disney influencing our lives, like for sure. Like there's a ton of other stuff, but it is a very big portion, and a lot of people spend a lot of hours out of their day, or the week, just like talking about it. So, yeah.
So that basically wraps up most of my feelings about Disney, like as a corporation, but also kind of a lot of how I thought about art. And most of these ideas were things that I didn't consciously have until I were trying to articulate them.
Which, again, is the power of a corporation like Disney, or a corporation of any nature, or even just art, man, is that it makes us think critically about the things that are just below the surface.
Right. So...
All right,
I think we're good to end it there.
So we'll call that a wrap. Thanks for listening, guys, and you're listening to Sporacity Channel.
Make sure to, I like that. Make sure to subscribe. I think we're gonna have this on YouTube, maybe Spotify. We're trying to figure stuff out where we can post this for our first episode, but
SoundCloud too.
Yeah, all that stuff.
So it would be really cool if you could support Zayden. This is his senior project, but this is also kind of something fun, and we kind of, I think the intention of this was we all thought it'd be super cool to find a way to influence people, right, and start these conversations similar to how Disney starts conversations, right, is to bring these things up and have people talk about it and have people think about it and form opinions based on that.
Also, we're going to be making the 10th Star Wars film very soon, just the four of us. So if you want to send all of your money to us immediately, that would be lovely.
Indeed. Make sure to, like and subscribe and all that good stuff, and we'll be here.
And if you have ideas or you have things you want us to talk about, email them to sporacity@gmail.com.
Yep. Yes. We hope to see you guys next week, and we hope you have enjoyed.
All right.
See you soon.
For listening.
Peace.
See you.
All right.